Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Thankful for Pell, Understanding the Past, Present, and Future of Need-Based Aid. I am your host today, Amy Bullock, and with me I have Daniel Barkowitz from Valencia College. Uh, let's see. Let's see. Daniel, can you see my slides?
Yes, yeah, I've
Okay.
got them.
Okay, so that's me, and my contact information. And here are our guests with us for today. As I said, that's Daniel. He's the Assistant Vice President for Financial Aid and Veterans Affairs at Valencia College. And he is also the President-elect for the Florida Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Did I get all that?
You did.
Yes.
Also
All right.
known as FAFSA, not to be
Yes.
confused with FAFSA, but yeah, you've got it right.
Yes, yes. So that's he'll be talking to us today. He'll be sharing his wealth of knowledge of financial aid with us. Daniel has what over 3 decades of financial aid experience, so we're very excited about that. And then we also have Carrie Warwick with us from National College Access Network. She's their Director of Policy and Advocacy, and she'll be talking briefly about their annual Thankful for Pell campaign, which we are in the thick of right now, and the work that we can all do to support their efforts to protect the Pell Grant and ensure its secure future. So, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You can submit questions in the question box as we're going. Typically, I wait till the end to answer questions, but if there are some that are really relevant to what's being discussed right at that moment, I might interrupt one of our speakers to have them answer that question then. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. You can share on social media about this webinar. You tweet at us at FL College Access and use the hashtags FCAN, FAFSA Challenge, Form Your Future, and FAFSA. You can tweet at NCAN at College Access and at Form Your Future. And Daniel would love if you would tweet at him at Barkowitz. Daniel is very active on Twitter and would love to have all of your FAFSA and financial aid questions. So for those of you who are new to FCAN, this might be your first webinar with us. I'll give you a little bit of background information about Florida College Access Network. Our mission at Florida College Access Network is to create and sustain a statewide network that catalyzes and supports communities across the state to improve college and career readiness, access, and completion for all students. And our vision is that by 2025, 60% of working age Floridians will have a high quality post-secondary degree or credential. So it's not just a bachelor's degree, but associate's degrees, workforce certificates, any of that kind of high quality training beyond high school that prepares students for a good job. And at FCAN, we accomplish our work in 3 main ways. We have local college access networks throughout the state that we support, and these are place-based initiatives that bring together folks from different sectors to all come and sit at the same table and talk about the issues of college access and success in their community. We have a research and policy team that looks at data related to student success and produces reports on that. If you're interested in FAFSA and Pell Grants and financial aid, we have several dashboards that might be of interest to you. Every year we publish the FAFSA Challenge data dashboard, which shows FAFSA completion rates. The one for last year is up, and the one for this year will be coming up in January. Right now, we have a first look FAFSA data dashboard, which shows raw numbers of FAFSA completion. So it doesn't show the rates, but it shows the raw numbers of FAFSA completion at Florida schools and districts. And then we have a national FAFSA completion dashboard that compares FAFSA completion rates across the different states. So you can find all of those on our research and policy page. And then we coordinate statewide initiatives across the state with the goal of promoting college and career readiness. Apply Yourself Florida, the FAFSA Challenge Decision Day, and a new initiative that is coming, Planet Florida. And if you are at a school or organization that wants to be involved in any of those, you can register at floridacollegeaccess.org/initiatives. Okay, so before we get started with our guest speakers, I'm going to share some fast facts about Pell in Florida. So about 60% of students who file a FAFSA in Florida are eligible for a Pell Grant. And this makes Florida the third highest in the nation for the proportion of Pell eligible students. So Pell is a big deal for Florida's students. Most students in Florida who complete a FAFSA are eligible for Pell Grants, and we have a huge number of the Pell eligible population. Now, the maximum Pell Grant at the federal level is $6,095, and that's just under the average tuition and fees cost of $6,464 at the average at a state university in Florida. And Daniel will be talking a little bit about the purchasing power of Pell later. Now, the maximum is $6,095. The average Pell Grant awarded in Florida is actually $3,611, and that's just under the average cost, or I'm sorry, just over the average cost of $3,240 at a state college. So Florida, because our tuition is affordable, we're actually more in line with the Pell Grant than some other states across the country. But it's important to keep in mind that that's only tuition and fees accounted for. That doesn't account for books, housing, meals, all of that. So there's a much larger total cost of attendance that Pell is not even approaching. And then some fast facts about FAFSA in Florida. So we talked about the high number of students who are eligible for Pell Grants. But even though we have a high proportion of Pell eligible students, by June 30th of last year, fewer than 50% of Florida's public high school students had completed the FAFSA. And because of this, Florida ranks 31st in the nation for FAFSA completion out of 50 states and DC. And also contributing to this is the fact that Florida has the fourth highest FAFSA error rate in the country. So that means that about 10% of FAFSAs that were submitted in Florida last year were either incomplete or incorrect. And this is just a screenshot from our FAFSA dashboard showing how some of that data breaks down. That said, while we have a lot of room to grow, Florida has done a lot of growth in the past several years. Back in 2015, when FCAN first started the FAFSA challenge, our yearly FAFSA completion rate was hovering around 38-39%, and now we are consistently around 49%. So that's gone up 10 percentage points. When we started the challenge, we were 41st in the nation for FAFSA completion. Now we're 31st, so we've climbed 10 places. So we've done a lot of progress, but we still have a lot of progress to go. But at the end of the day, what is really exciting is the fact that because we have done this because communities across Florida have done extra work to get more students completing the FAFSA, it means that more students have access to Pell Grants and that they can attend college and afford college, which they might not have been able to do otherwise. And that's why we have Daniel and Carrie with us today. So one last thing before I hand things over to Carrie, we're always looking for FAFSA stories to help with our advocacy work. So if you have stories about students who are struggling with completing the FAFSA, or struggling with getting the Pell Grant money that they should qualify for, we want you to share those with us. So if you have a Florida-related FAFSA story, you can send that to me at abullock@floridacollegeaccess.org. And if you have a national FAFSA story, you can contact Jack Porter at porterj@collegeaccess.org. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carrie to talk about Thankful4Pell.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm thrilled to be here today, and NCAN is very grateful for Florida CAN's partnership in this campaign and inviting us to be here on the webinar and sharing the campaign materials across the Florida network. So we are right, as Amy said, in the midst, in the thick, in the exact middle of the campaign, which started yesterday and goes through tomorrow. The Thankful4Pell campaign is in its 5th year, and it's NCAN's annual initiative to express our gratitude around this season of thanks to Congress for the Pell Grant and the foundation that it sets for need-based aid for college going. So we are, so that's pretty much the goal in a nutshell, that we're looking for advocates for the Pell Grant campaign, recipients of the Pell Grant, alumni of the Pell Grant program, to share with Congress why they're thankful for the program, and particularly this year, after we've had back-to-back Pell Grant increases, to say thank you, because that is a choice. For a number of years, that increase happened automatically, but for the last 2 years, that those increases were only because of specific action from Congress, and I think Daniel's going to cover that later, so a little teaser there. NCAN has an action center. It should be linked through this slide, or if the hyperlink's not working, it's collegeaccess.org/action is how you get to it. Or if you just go to Google NCAN and go to our policy tab, there's an action page under the policy tab. So it should be pretty easy to find. We are also all over Twitter this week. If you don't feel like sending a whole email to your elected official, you can also tweet at them. Just make sure you get their handle in your tweet so that they see it, and use the hashtag Thankful4Pell so that we see it. We'll be on both Twitter and Facebook, and we're having a Twitter chat today at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are super excited about everything you learned from Daniel and you want to come talk about it, a great place to do that is Twitter today at 2 p.m. I will be there under my Twitter handle, which is just my name at Carrie Warwick, and it will be led by our main NCAN handle at College Access. So I'm happy to take any questions at the end, but I think that pretty much sums it up for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. And before I hand things over to Daniel, I just want to mention really quick, I forgot to say at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded, and I will share the recording and the slides afterwards, so no need to worry about that. And with that, I'm going to hand controls over to Daniel. Before I do that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't all have to watch me watch Daniel. So we'll stop sharing my webcam, and Daniel is going to be made the presenter.
Hey, give me 1 second. Let me get mine organized. And let's go to monitor 2. So here we go. So can everyone see, let me move my picture out of the way, but can everyone see the federal Pell Grant Thankful4Pell slide?
Yep, Daniel, we got it.
Great, wonderful. So thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Amy, for the invitation and the chance to speak with you today about Pell Grant. I am personally thankful for the Pell Grant. It is the foundation, as you know, of the federal financial aid programs, which by extension really is the foundation of all of the financial aid programs. So the goal of today is to give you some history, some knowledge, and some information about Pell. And so given that we are in the midst of a season of gratitude, I thought it was a nice setting to begin with a little bit of a Thanksgiving imagery. So there you see the Thankful4Pell logo. We're gonna, along those lines, here's an agenda of what we're gonna cover today. So we're gonna start with a little bit of history, sort of like the first Thanksgiving. I'll give you a little bit of background, and for those of you that love studying history, this will be perfect for you. For the rest of you, just remember, if we don't remember what we've done before, we're doomed to repeat it. So, you know, again, it's a goal here to understand where Pell has come from and where financial aid has come from, really nationwide. So we'll spend a little time talking about that. I'll talk about the Pell Grant. We'll give you some background and information for those of you that may not be as conversant with the ins and outs of the Pell Grant program. We'll do a little bit on the purchasing power of Pell. What does Pell buy today versus what did it buy 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago? Where have we come with the program? And as a little bit of dessert, I'll share with you a little bit about Valencia College's story, especially in the last several years, and what we've done to both pass the message of Pell and encourage students who are eligible to take full advantage of what's able and what's available for them. So to start, let me first give you a little bit of personal background. So as you heard from Amy, I've been working in financial aid for about 30 years. Much of my career was spent in the New England area, and I've worked for colleges and universities up there. I've also spent some time working for student lenders, student servicers, and consulting companies working on IT for financial aid. So I have a varied background. I've been here in Florida for about 3 years. And so, in my time working with financial aid and within the financial aid world, I've learned a bit about the history of financial aid and wanted to start really here. So if you think about the history of financial aid or think about higher ed within the United States itself, it really goes back to the foundation of Harvard back in 1636. Keeping in mind that Harvard was the first college in America before, if you will, there was really even America as a country, the United States as a country. So Harvard, founded in 1636, it was really originally set up as a place to train ministers. And as part of that, they had a tuition, obviously an amount that had to be paid. And from the very beginning, Harvard really focused on trying to provide access to the worthy and deserving through Harvard College. So as part of the expansion of higher education, and I'm doing a very, very quick survey here. So I would urge those of you who don't know the history of higher education to do some research. But the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and then the Morrill Acts of 1862 and following were really the establishment of land grants for educational institutions. And the idea here was that the federal government ceded to the states land that could be sold, and the benefit of that, the dollars raised, were to set up institutions of higher education within the states themselves. So in Florida, we have 2 land-grant institutions. The first is FSU, and the second is FAMU. They are land-grant institutions here within the state of Florida. So in those early days, financial aid was really reserved, as I said, for those students who were deemed needy and deserving. There was no standardized system for awarding financial aid. It was unorganized, and the process was heavily influenced by donors and heavily driven by the community. The community would adopt the student to provide resource, maybe housing, maybe funds, maybe books to help the student through their higher education or their post-secondary education, if you will. So the Department of Education wasn't established until 1867 under the Department of Education Act. It was signed into law by President Andrew Johnson. This was not a cabinet level position, and it was only a 1-year appointment originally. It was renamed the Office of Education, but then ultimately turned into part of the Labor Department before it was set up again as a standalone department later on in history. But really the financial aid, if you think about the history of financial aid, the explosion is really due, the explosion of higher education itself in America is really due to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the act that we refer to colloquially as the GI Bill, right? So the GI Bill provided opportunities for servicemen and women, but mostly men in 1944, coming back from abroad to have an opportunity to be educated within our higher education systems. And those benefits and the payment of those benefits created a demand for education which couldn't keep up with the supply. So there were a number of colleges that were established in the 40s and later as a result of the number of servicemen and women coming back. This is important because the funding, it sort of opened up the door for federal funding of higher education through the GI Bill. So, if people ask you what's the connection between Pell and the GI Bill, again, the idea here is that the precedent was set for federal funds, federal dollars to be spent for paying for higher education with the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. In the early to mid 50s, those servicemen graduated, and there was now huge supply without the demand. So the opposite became apparent. There was increased competition for students, there was bidding wars, and a desire to start awarding institutional money to try to replace or supplant what was being left behind by the federal government not expending now the dollars and resources to make it possible for students to attend. So then we have Sputnik in 1957. As a reminder for those of you who weren't around, and I wasn't, but this is close to when I was here, 1957 Sputnik, the Russians launched the first manned spacecraft, and there was a desire on the part of America to equate or to equal what the Russians had done, and so the space race began. And as a result of that, the National Defense Act of 1958 was signed into law by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This was considered a national science emergency, and the idea was to fund state and local schools so that instruction could be strengthened in science, math, and foreign languages. As part of the National Defense Act, the first federal financial aid program passed the GI Bill was signed into law. Many people mistakenly assumed that the Pell Grant was the first financial aid program. It was not. It was actually the National Defense Student Loan, which was later renamed the National Direct Student Loan. Don't get that confused with today's direct loan, because finally it was renamed the Perkins Loan. And sadly, this program has expired in the last several years as the federal government has tried to streamline its financial aid programs. But Perkins loans were the first type of financial aid program post the GI Bill that were established in the country. And again, the date here is 1958. So following 1958, as part of the war on poverty, Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964 signed into law the Economic Opportunity Act. And the idea here, as part of the war on poverty and part of the civil rights movement, was to think about desegregation in both higher education and public education in the K through 12 marketplace. And as part of that program, again, now we're on the second post-GI Bill federal financial aid program, it was college work study. So the idea of the college work study program was to encourage colleges to send their students out into the world to help work on civil justice, social justice. So really the goal of the college work study program, originally envisioned by the Economic Opportunity Act, was to get students paid to work in the community to help, again, desegregate and focus on poverty initiatives. So now we come to the Higher Education Act of 1965, and many of us refer to this as sort of the foundational financial aid structure, and it's true. But again, the reason I'm doing the history is to give you a sense that there were precedents in financial aid before the Higher Education Act of 1965. And as you can read on the slide, the program here was really to provide financial assistance for students and strengthen our colleges and universities. And again, 1965 is the foundational year. As a reminder, the Higher Education Act is reauthorized every 5 to 10 years, although it's been now more than that since we have had a reauthorization. But this is the foundational law. And when we refer to Title IV financial aid, we're referring to Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So as part of the Higher Education Act, it did incorporate the existing federal aid programs, namely what was the National Defense Student Loan Program, Perkins, and the College Work Study Program, into the Title IV of that act. They also, in the Act of 1965, created something called the Educational Opportunity Grant. And you can see here the original limits and amounts. Don't get confused. So that original grant, the Educational Opportunity Grant, is not what became the Pell. It's not. That is a program that was created, again, originally to help limited families with limited means. That program has evolved into what today we refer to as the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. I'll show you that in our next slide. So it's not until 1972 then that actually what became the Pell Grant is established. So if you will, this is the, if I do my math right, this is the 46th birthday of the Pell Grant. So the Basic Educational Opportunity Grant, or BEOG, was created in 1972. And this was the first reauthorization of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So 7 years later, Congress came back and reauthorized it, and as part of that, created this program. It had a separate application, so you had to apply separately just for this program. Had a separate methodology to determine if you were eligible. The original amount was $1,400 per year, minus whatever your family contribution was, and there was a limit of half of your cost of attendance for that institution. And in 1980, the program was renamed the Pell Grant in honor of Senator Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island, who was instrumental in creating the program. This was the brainchild of his work, very famous, long-lasting senator from Rhode Island. And again, the program was renamed Pell in his honor to memorialize the fact that he had been so involved in the creation of the program. And again, the foundation of the higher education amendments were to affirm our commitment to equal educational opportunity as a nation. And as part of that, the EOG, that original Educational Opportunity Grant, was renamed SEOG, and income limits at that point were removed from the program. There were later Pell changes, and we're going to go over some of these a little later as we talk through the rest of the slides. But again, we moved from the 70s, and in this one slide, I just want to highlight some of those changes. In 1994, Pell Grant funding was revoked for incarcerated students who were in prison but pursuing higher education programs were allowed funding up to 1994. There are some experiments that are going on right now within the federal government to reintroduce Pell Grant funding for incarcerated students. We don't know where that's heading ultimately, but that federal government does run what they call experimental sites. And it's not my college, but there's a college in Florida that's part of this experiment. So we'll find out how this program has worked for them and whether there'll be in fact changes on that regard. From the period of 2009 to 2011, there was summer Pell Grant funding or year-round Pell Grant funding allowed. It was only an experiment that lasted 2 years and sadly went away. There were some complications, and we'll talk a little more about summer Pell Grant in a moment. As of 2012-13, however, a new feature for Pell Grant, the Lifetime Eligibility Used Indicator, was introduced. And again, we'll talk about this, but this put limits on how long a student could receive Pell Grant, and I'll share a little more detail about that as we go forward. And then finally, in 2017, so really, if you will, last summer, Pell Grant year-round funding was reintroduced thanks to a bill of Congress and signed by the president. And I'll share a little bit about Valencia's story in terms of how we've helped students take advantage of this additional funding. So when you hear about Carrie sharing the increases in funding, this is one of those pieces that we do and we are very thankful for. It has made possible educational opportunity for students year-round, and especially a college like mine, a community college or historically community college. This is a phenomenal piece for students who need access to Pell. So let's talk a little bit about the limits and requirements of the Pell Grant. So as a reminder, Pell Grant's limited to undergraduate enrollment only. So it cannot be used to help pay for anything beyond the first undergraduate degree, bachelor's degree. So obviously if you get your associate's degree, you can keep on going, but once you get your first bachelor's degree, that's considered the cessation of the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant ends at that point and you can't go farther with funding. You're not eligible if you aren't a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen. There are categories for eligible non-citizens, which include permanent residents, who can be eligible for the Pell Grant. You are not eligible if you're in default on the federal student loan. You owe a federal student grant repayment. There's this issue about having a drug conviction while receiving federal aid. You cannot receive Pell Grant if that is true. The reason there's an asterisk there is because this continues to be reviewed, and this is an area where, again, your advocacy would be helpful. Right now, you might make the argument that having been convicted for drugs has no bearing on your need for funding, and this is both use and distribution. So you have there are rules around rehabilitating yourself going through a drug treatment program or awareness program, but it tends to be complicated. For men, you have to be registered for the Selective Service. When I talk to students these days, they have no idea what Selective Service even is. As a reminder, that is the draft. We haven't used the draft in this country in many, many years. But for men, they are required to be registered for Selective Service before they can receive federal financial aid, including the Pell Grant. You have to be degree seeking to receive the Pell Grant. You can't receive the Pell Grant just to take courses for fun. You have to be in a valid degree. And you have to make progress, satisfactory progress, toward the completion of that degree. And we could delve into what satisfactory academic progress means, but that really is beyond the scope of our time together today. But I'm happy to take questions about that offline if you have them. So the next piece to share with you is that Pell Grant is based on your family contribution and your enrollment level. So the expected family contribution is the output that comes out of filing the FAFSA. When a family files the FAFSA, the EFC, which is what we colloquially refer to it as, is a measure of what the family should be able to afford over the course of the year. And in 2018-19, EFCs from 0 to 5486 might be Pell eligible. Depends on their enrollment level and the cost of attendance of the institution. I'll give you some sample awards in a second, but that's the sort of basic range of eligibility. In fact, people always get confused about the income levels. Can I just give an income cutoff for Pell? You can't, because the family contribution formula takes into account much more than just simply income. It looks at the number in family, the number in college. It's a fairly complex and complicated formula. So there's no real chance for you to just simply rule out a family based on income. Our best advice is always to apply for financial aid. If a family feels they need help, they should apply. And since Pell Grant is only one of, it's a major one, but one of a number of financial aid programs, even if a family is not eligible for Pell, they may be eligible for other funding. As you heard Amy mention, for this year, the full-time full-year award for a zero family contribution is $6,095. And again, what happens is that is the maximum award. It then is segmented or rationed based on where the family contribution is. So it's not as though everyone from 0 EFC to 5486 EFC gets that amount. The number decreases as the EFC rises. And there are tables that one can obtain from the federal government every year that gives the payment information. If the student's enrolled for one semester only, then the amount is actually half. So as opposed to $6,095, it's really $3,047.50. Since my running joke is that financial aid makes no sense, then we would round that to $3,048. But that gives you a sense of where the award is. There is a limit for cost of attendance, and Amy mentioned in the initial slides that in Florida our costs are relatively low. I just want to say a word about cost of attendance here. If the cost of attendance for the program is less than $6,094, then there is a reduction of the maximum Pell Grant. Cost of attendance, just to be aware, is a jargon piece that we throw around in financial aid often, but that includes more than just tuition and fees. So that includes living expenses, books and supplies, transportation, miscellaneous expenses. So it's in most institutions' cases, they're going to have a cost of attendance that's greater than $6,094. Even, for example, at my institution where tuition and fees is very, very low, our cost of attendance budget, by the time you throw in all those pieces, books, room and board, transit, etc., is going to be higher than that $6,094 figure. If the academic program is measured in clock hours or is not standard, there are other formula that are used, or to use the proper Latin formulae, that are used to determine the Pell Grant award. But I just wanted to put out there that information. So if you're working with a program that is non-standard, there could be additional limits or restrictions. And the best advice is to either talk to the financial aid office or look at the awarding charts for that particular program. So to give you some sample awards, for a student who's less than full-time with a 0 EFC, as I said before, the award is prorated. So look at the left side of the screen. You'll see, for example, at full-time for one semester, and I've rounded these numbers, it's $3,048. There are multiple enrollment levels that we measure. So either 3/4 time, half time, or less than half time. And you can see how the proration occurs. So a student who's awarded a full Pell of $6,095, right, would actually get a reduced amount based on where they are in their full-time, 3/4 time, half time enrollment. So on the other side, this is if you will, the highest Pell a student could receive. On the right, you'll see the highest EFC that would have eligibility, and that's a 5486 EFC. And you can see that at that level, the 3/4 time, half time, less than half time commitment is 0, and only a full-time student would get Pell of any dollar amount. So you can see the range of how this works based on enrollment. I will say to you, the research shows that for students who are Pell eligible, the vast majority, about 60 to 65%, depending upon the year in which you conduct the research, have a 0 family contribution. So clearly a majority of the students in the program, in the Pell program, wind up with a maximum Pell, but there are students really across the spectrum who get other Pell amounts based on their family contribution formula. So before I jump into the purchasing power of Pell, Amy, this might be a good time to check in with you to see if we have any questions that have come through that you'd like to address before we move forward.
Yes, that's great, Daniel. We actually do have one question that potentially you can help with. It's from Allie. She says, "Thank you for this. I'm confused about the funding stream for Pell. I understand that a portion of it was or is mandatory, but believe most is subject to annual appropriations process and no longer tied to inflationary index, ended in 2017, right? Can you clarify if any portion is still mandatory, and if so, what portion and where, as well as the appropriation portions of the grant?"
So yes, it's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but you are right that in fact a portion of the Pell is in fact mandatory and non-discretionary. One of the challenges is while there is an annual amount set, it's not until the budget actually goes through that that amount is finalized. So for example, in this year, we're grateful that there's been an increase to the maximum award, but that increase is discretionary at the level of Congress. I don't in front of me have the portion that is mandatory versus the portion that's discretionary. I'm happy to follow up with that after we're done because it's not in the material I prepared for today, and I don't want to misquote it. But I will say you are correct in your statement, and this is why, again, our advocacy and students' advocacy on behalf of Pell Grant is so important, because this is an annual allocation. And while it's true, the program has actually been running a surplus, there hasn't been as much expense as has been budgeted. We're always in danger of potentially losing Pell if Congress decides that there are other priorities for that funding. So great question, great point. And as I say, Amy, I'll follow up with some more details on that.
That's
Okay.
great, Daniel. And then we just had another question come in from Katrina. If a student starts college in the summer after high school and takes 6 credits at college, how much Pell Grant can they be awarded since 6 credits in a 6-week summer semester is actually full time?
So great question. So first of all, the first part of the answer to that is, as is the classic financial aid answer, and hopefully you'll laugh at this with me, it depends. But let me specify why it depends. So the first piece to know is summer can either be a header or a trailer for the academic year, and that can be dependent by school. So I'll answer that question from Valencia's perspective. Here at Valencia, summer is a trailer to the academic year. So for example, a student who attended this last summer, that was actually part of the 2017-18 academic year for us. A student who attends a college where that's a header, that would be part of the 2018-19 academic year. So the first piece to understand is which academic year does the college consider that summer to be part of? That's an important distinction because that will guide which year's FAFSA needs to be completed. So that's the first piece to keep in mind. The second piece is that there is no adjustment for full-time status. So there's one issue, Katrina, in your question, which is 6 credits is 6 credits is 6 credits. There's no, in the undergraduate level, the federal government's very specific about what is considered full-time, and it's 12 credits in a period of enrollment. So a student who is 6 credits in the summer, let's say, using the slide we're on, that there is 0 contribution EFC, using this year's award level, that student would qualify for $1,524 in that semester. That would be their award. So again, there's no distinction made between summer versus other terms. And in fact, many colleges now have what they call mini-mesters or modules or anything like that, where the same would be true. So then that could be fall or spring, not just summer. So hopefully that answers your question. And we're going to talk a little more about summer Pell or year-round Pell as we move forward, because that is something that was added fairly recently. I've saved that piece for a little later. So with that, let's move forward. We'll take, if you have other questions, please submit them. We will take them as we go. But I want to spend a little time talking about the value of Pell over time. So first, if you have not looked at the College Board's Trends series at collegeboard.org or collegeboard.com, do a search for Trends. There are a couple of annual publications that are on my must-read list. One of them is the Trends in Higher Education, Trends in Financial Aid, Trends in College Pricing. This comes from trends in higher education. And particularly what you can see here is over time, and by the way, I should say, this is in 2016 dollars. So these numbers have been retroactively adjusted for inflation. So these are not, the dollar amounts as of the year in which they were awarded. These are retroactively adjusted to account for inflation. But you can see over time where the maximum Pell Grant has fit if you adjust for inflation, and that we've seen, a devaluing of the equivalent value of Pell, that at least as of 16-17, and that's the last data that the College Board's released, for the maximum Pell Grant has regained much of the support. You could also see, though, that it hasn't increased over time. So that's another piece to sort of look at. Average Pell Grant per recipient, similarly. So again, we've regained some of what was lost, and you can see that the low point for Pell funding was roughly in the mid to late 90s, or actually even lower here in the early 80s, but that we've regained much of what was lost, and that's due in part to advocacy. It's also due in part, frankly, to the ongoing need for funding within the structure. So if we go forward, this chart gives you, again, same source, trends in higher education. This gives you a little more information, keeping in mind, by the way, obviously, Pell, as we said, started in 1972. So this gives you some more information about Pell recipients. So you can see in current dollars versus constant dollars what the actual award was in total. This is in millions. How much award was given out system-wide. What the actual maximum award was each of those years, what the actual minimum award was each of those years, what the number of recipients was, and interestingly, what percent of those recipients were independent versus dependent. So as a reminder, right, federal financial aid is both applicable for dependent students, the traditionally aged student going to undergraduate education, the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, but also available for students who are over 24 or are married or a veteran. Pell might be applicable or have a child of their own. Pell might be applicable and is applicable to that group as well. And interestingly, that over half, for much of the history, over half of the Pell dollars have been provided to those students, or at least recipient-wise, to those students who are actually independent students, because they tend not to have parents to rely upon for funding. So their EFCs tend to be Pell eligible at maybe a little higher rate, although we're approaching near parity. I don't have, be interested to look at how many filers were independent versus dependent in the system. That's not part of this, but interesting question. So how much does Pell actually cover? So again, same source, College Board Trends in Higher Education. As a reminder, you'll get copies of these slides, so you'll have them for your own records as well. Amy shared with you a little bit about how much Pell covers in the state of Florida. For our students at Valencia, if they're an in-state student attending Valencia, it can cover their full tuition and give them a refund back to help with books and other expenses. But is that true really overall? And you can see, again, private nonprofit 4-year tuition fees and room and board, and here's the maximum Pell Grant. So for in the private sector, right, Pell is just a small portion of what actually is needed to help fund tuition fees or tuition fees and room and board. And the chart on the right gives you those percentages. So Pell can be a huge factor as part of tuition and fees nationwide, but over time, that percentage has shrunk. And that is in part because while tuition and fees have grown, the Pell Grant dollars have not kept pace with that growth of tuition and fees, neither in the public sector nor in the private non-for-profit sector. And another slide to share with you, or the last slide, to sort of make this point, and this comes from the United Negro College Fund's really wonderful resource, the Purchasing Power of Pell Grants. You can see that as of 15-16, the purchasing power of Pell Grant had dropped to its lowest level ever. So this is where, again, we encourage your advocacy, or I do. We're hopeful to recover some of the lost ground here. Students who have Pell, at least in Florida, are very successful, but that story may not be true nationwide. There are issues, or even in Florida in some of our sectors, there are places where without additional support, Pell only provides a fraction of what's necessary to actually pay the full cost of higher education. So with that in mind, let's jump into our next section, a little more detail about the Pell LEU. So I just want to give you a little history about what the lifetime eligibility used represents. So as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2012, signed into law in December 2011, students were limited to the equivalent of 12 semesters of full Pell Grant eligibility, or basically 600% of the annual maximum award. And this is a measure that was added and began to be measured as of 2012. No appeals are allowed for this, so once a student uses their 6 years, they're done. So all of the years count that they receive Pell, but it's measured by a percentage of their maximum award. So let me give you an example. So for a student who is full-time, going 100% of the time, and has a full Pell, or the Pell that they're eligible for, doesn't have to be a full Pell, can be whatever amount they're eligible for. Each one of those years, fall and spring, counts as 100%. The idea here is the government wanted to limit the student at the undergraduate level to 6 years, the equivalent of 6 years or 12 semesters of funding. Obviously, most undergraduate programs don't take 12 semesters. Hopefully, students are done in 8, 9, or 10 semesters with their bachelor's degree. But for students who need that additional time, either they changed their program or they've had academic difficulty, there was an artificial limit, cap, placed on the amount of Pell that a student can receive. All years count, but there is a discount. The fourth bullet here says based on their actual EFC level and their enrollment status. So for example, a student who's enrolled half-time, fall and spring, wouldn't use 100% of that year. They would use 50% of that year. So again, half-time fall, half-time spring, they've used half of their annual limit, so they've used 50%. So the problem here is that students could run out of Pell Grant before they finish their bachelor's degree, primarily if they switch programs, if they obtain more than one associate's degree, or if they have significant academic difficulty. It is possible that they could run out of federal Pell Grant. With the introduction of year-round Pell, which we're going to turn to in a moment, it is possible that students could use up to 150% of their Pell limit in 1 year. If they get a full-time award fall, a full-time award spring, and a full-time award summer, you actually add those together, that becomes 150%. The idea being that, again, it's measured, if you will, by semesters and by the use of that semester. So with that in mind, let's turn to year-round Pell. I'm going to spend a little time just giving you a little bit of background about who we are at Valencia College. For those of you who don't know, we are the state college for Orange and Osceola counties here in Florida. That includes the metropolitan areas of Orlando and Kissimmee. We have 8 campuses, soon to be 9. We're opening up a downtown campus next fall, and really exciting piece that we're able to do this downtown in cooperation with our partners at UCF. In 2017-18, you can see our enrollment was about 61,000. That is total headcount. The full-time equivalent was about 31,000. We have approximately a third of our students are enrolled full-time. 2/3 of our students are part-time. The average age of our students is about 23, I believe. So we are a little more non-traditionally aged, but as compared to many of the state colleges in Florida, we have a younger crowd than many of our peers do. You can see in 2017-18, we received over 72,000 FAFSAs, and based on their eligibility and choice to enroll, about nearly 22,000 students were identified and funded as Pell Grant recipients here at Valencia in 2017-18. It represents about $77 million of Pell Grants that our students received here at Valencia. It is the single largest source of funding at Valencia for students, is the Pell Grant. And as you see at Valencia, as I shared with you earlier, and this is in keeping with the national number, about 62% of our Pell Grant recipients have a zero family contribution. So they're receiving that full Pell. They're the neediest of students within the Pell. So as a reminder, summer Pell or year-round Pell was reintroduced in the spring of 2017. And as part of that introduction, the program actually began with a 17-18 award year, and students were eligible for at least 150% or up to 150% of their scheduled Pell award. Students had to be enrolled at least half-time in the payment period in which the student got that additional Pell. So that if they enrolled full-time in the fall, full-time in the spring, but then 3 hours in the summer, they would not get that additional Pell if summer were a trailer. As I explained before, crossover periods, summers, could either be a header or a trailer, could be different student by student. Colleges can tell you what their policy is. And it was eligible for transfer students as well. So students could qualify for additional Pell in the period in which they transfer. Students could also access both whatever's left of their 100% Pell. So let's say, for example, they were 3/4 time, 3/4 time. So between that, they used 75%, but in fall and spring. But then they came back in the summer for full-time enrollment. They could use the remainder of their initial 100% plus whatever was extra, and that was allowable in the program. So the foundation of year-round Pell is that students could earn another term of Pell within the same award year. And there are no requirements, unlike the previous implementation, of what's called acceleration. We think, that's the reason for the question, Mark, we think the government's intention for half-time attendance being required in that third term was a way to encourage students to make academic progress, not for this to be sort of an experiment or just to pay for one class, but really to encourage students to pursue the acceleration of their degree. And again, you could see in that third term, they could have the greater of whatever was left over or the 50%, limited to whatever Pell they would earn at that enrollment level. So here's what we did at Valencia to share the news of year-round Pell. First of all, in last fall, we sent a letter to every enrolled student who received Pell informing them that this was coming. In the spring, we also sent targeted communications to individual Pell populations to share with them that this was occurring, and we encouraged them to think about full-time enrollment. And if you were enrolled in fall less than full-time, but you might benefit from more Pell, we encouraged those students also to think about greater summer enrollment. And if you were enrolled fall and spring but didn't use your full-time Pell, we still encouraged summer enrollment if that was going to be feasible for you. And I want to share a little bit more about our outreach. I'm moving rather quickly because I'm also recognizing we have about 7 minutes left in our time together. But if you have more questions about this, you can certainly reach out to me after the session's done. We did a number of different outreach efforts through our advising and counseling team. We talked to faculty and had faculty communicate this, through our staff and leadership, and through public and social media outreach. And just to share with you a little bit about the history here, you can see over time how many Pell Grant recipients we've had and the Pell Grant amounts. You can also see that we had from 16-17 to 17-18 an increase of $8 million, or nearly, if you will, $9 million in Pell as a result of this introduction of year-round Pell. There's another story to be told about our loans, which we won't get to today, but historically we've had a marked reduction in the number of students borrowing loans here at Valencia. And again, that's a subject beyond the scope of today's information. Here's the information that I think is probably most interesting. We actually wound up in the introduction of year-round Pell. This is the number of credit hours attempted by Pell students in each individual summer, summer of 16, summer of 17, and summer of 18, as well as the total number of Pell students, summer of 16, 17, and 18. You can see that our Pell enrolled students grew by 50%, or the equivalent is it was 150% of the previous summer. So there was a real success here at Valencia with summer Pell. The piece for growth is in terms of students who actually went full-time. You can see our fall full-time number spring full-time number, and then summer full-time number for Pell recipients. This is limited to Pell recipients. You can see that although we grew the number of full-time Pell recipients from approximately 700 to approximately 1,100, there still is plenty of growth potential as compared to our fall and spring full-time Pell enrollment. So with that said, the net result here is that 3,040 of our students had Pell for greater than 100%. That was about 14% of our Pell population. On average, they used 126% of their annual Pell. The average increased Pell Grant was about $1,800, and the total increase attributable to year-round Pell was about $5.5 million. So it was a real successful outreach campaign here at Valencia around the introduction of year-round Pell. So with that, this is my contact information. You are welcome, and again, this will be shared with you after the workshop is over. You're welcome to approach me with questions. Email is really my preferred modality, or Twitter. I didn't list my Twitter handle here, but it's @Barkowitz, at my last name. You're welcome to approach me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation after today and once we're done. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Amy. Would you like control of the presentation again?
Yeah, I'm going to give myself control.
Great.
Okay, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much, Daniel, for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. We do have one or two questions that we'll get to in these last few minutes, but before that, I just want to mention our next webinar coming up very quickly, which is on meeting the college access and success needs of rural students. So it's a topic we're really excited about. So make sure to register for that at floridacollegeaccess.org/tag/upcoming webinar. All right, Daniel. Question that came on regarding the lifetime Pell was, if a student is under the 600% threshold but has had more than 6 years worth of Pell awarded, would they still qualify for additional Pell grants?
That's a great question. Yes, they would. So again, with the presumption they're still pursuing their first bachelor's degree and still meet all the other eligibility requirements, including satisfactory progress, they could. So again, if you think about a pure example, a student who's going half-time could get, half-time always, could get up to the equivalent of 12 years because they're eating into their LEU a little slower. And that was the intention of measuring it by percentage, so that we wouldn't penalize students, or the government wouldn't penalize students who were pursuing at a rate less than full-time. Great question.
And then the last question was, and I think you just touched on this, but just to clarify, a student who already has earned a bachelor's degree is not eligible for Pell, regardless of whether they received it in the past.
That is correct. So again, that is a hard and fast rule. So once you have a bachelor's degree, and by the way, that could be domestic or foreign if it's considered equivalent to U.S. bachelor's degree. Once the student's received a bachelor's degree, that is the cutoff point beyond which Pell can no longer fund. So the idea here of Pell is to allow funding for the first bachelor's degree that a student pursues.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is all the questions we have today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And again, we will be making these slides and the recording available in the next couple of days. So watch your email, your inbox. Within the next 72 hours or so, you should be getting an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides. All right.